March 1945, Southern Germany. Inside a former school building now ringed with barbed wire. The war feels distant but unfinished. The classrooms are cold. Windows are cracked. Chalk dust still clings to blackboards bearing half-erased arithmetic from another life. Rows of German women sit on wooden benches. Some wear threadbare civilian coats. Others still have the stiff posture of wartime service. Auxiliaries, clerks, radio operators, administrators. They are prisoners now, captured not on a battlefield, but in the collapse that followed it. Boots echo in the corridor. An American officer enters, followed by a corporal carrying a crate. There is no shouting, no interrogation forms, no translator barking orders. The crate is opened. Inside are notebooks, pencils, simple writing paper. The women exchange looks, confused, wary, almost offended. This is not what they expected from their captors. They had prepared for punishment, for hunger, for silence. Instead, they are told to sit straighter, to write their names, to describe their lives, to put thoughts into words. For a moment, the room holds its breath, because in the wreckage of Nazi Germany, something unexpected is about to begin, an experiment shaped not by revenge, but by reconstruction and rooted in decisions made long before these women ever became prisoners. By the spring of 1945, Germany was no longer a functioning state. It was a landscape of fragments. Cities lay shattered. Rail lines were twisted into rusted knots. Civil authority had evaporated in many regions, replaced by ad hoc local councils, fleeing officials, or nothing at all. The Third Reich, which had promised permanence and order, was collapsing inward under the weight of military defeat. 4 German women. The end of the war did not bring immediate relief. It brought uncertainty. Throughout the conflict, women had been drawn deeply into the machinery of the Nazi state. Millions served as clerks, typists, factory workers, telephone operators, nurses, and auxiliaries attached to military and administrative units. Others worked in civil offices that enforced rationing, labor assignments, or population records. By 1945, this meant that large numbers of women were entangled, directly or indirectly, in the functioning of a defeated regime. When Allied forces advanced into Germany, they did not encounter only soldiers. They encountered administrators, secretaries, and records. They encountered women who knew how systems worked. This made them important, not as combatants, but as custodians of memory and bureaucracy. The United States Army had anticipated this moment. Long before the invasion of Normandy, American planners had debated what occupation would mean. The lessons of World War I loomed large. After 1918, Germany had been defeated militarily, but left politically embittered. American policymakers were determined not to repeat that mistake. Victory, they believed, would have to be followed by transformation. This thinking gave rise to a structured occupation doctrine. It emphasized control, security, and stability, but also reorientation. The U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division and later the Information Control Division were tasked with managing civilian populations, overseeing denazification, and reshaping public life. Their mandate extended beyond policing. It reached into education, media, and civic behavior. Women prisoners occupied a complicated place within this framework. Some were formally classified as prisoners of war, particularly those attached to military units. Others were detained as civilian internees, held for investigation, screening, or administrative reasons. Their confinement was legal, but its purpose was not purely punitive. These women were viewed as both potential risks and potential participants in Germany's future. Conditions inside American-run facilities varied by region and time. In early months, shortages were severe. Food was rationed. Buildings were improvised. Guards were often young, exhausted soldiers who had just come through combat. Yet compared to the Eastern Front or some Allied detention systems elsewhere, U.S. camps were relatively orderly. Regulations emphasized discipline, hygiene, and documentation. What distinguished American camps most sharply was intent. U.S. Army manuals explicitly stated that prisoners were to be treated humanely, not out of charity, but because discipline and legitimacy mattered. Abuse bred resentment. Order bred compliance. And compliance, in time, could open the door to change. As the fighting ended, American commanders faced a new question. How do you dismantle an ideology that has shaped a population for 12 years? How do you deal with people who are not hardened criminals, but not innocent bystanders either? The answer, still forming in March 1945, would draw on an American belief that ideas could be confronted with ideas, that behavior could be reshaped not only through force, but through structure, language, and education. And it was within this unresolved tension between custody and correction that the first quiet steps toward classroom instruction would take place. The pencils handed out in that cold schoolroom were not an accident. They were the product of planning that had begun long before the war ended, and they signaled a shift from military victory towards something far more complex. The American occupation of Germany did not begin in 1945. It began on paper years earlier, inside offices in Washington and London, where planners debated what kind of peace would follow total war. By 1943, U.S. military and civilian authorities were already drafting directives for a defeated Germany, documents that outlined not only how to govern territory, but how to reshape society itself. At the center of this planning was a belief that Nazism had not survived on force alone. It had survived through language, repetition, and education. Schools, youth organizations, newspapers, and radio had all been instruments of indoctrination. If Germany was to be rebuilt without repeating its past, those instruments would have to be dismantled or redirected. This conviction shaped the policies that American forces carried with them as they crossed the Rhine. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued orders that went beyond disarmament. Nazi symbols were banned. Party organizations were dissolved. Teachers, editors, and civil servants were screened. The goal was not merely to remove leaders, but to neutralize the ideas that had sustained them. Within this framework, women held particular significance. Nazi ideology had defined women primarily as mothers and supporters of the state, yet in practice, wartime necessity had drawn them into administration, communication, and logistics. Many women possessed literacy, organizational skills, and familiarity with bureaucratic processes. These traits made them useful and dangerous, depending on how they were applied. American occupation authorities understood this duality. Women detainees were often questioned not for acts of violence, but for knowledge. Who had worked where? Who had written reports? Who had typed orders? The ability to read and write, once an unremarkable skill, became a point of leverage. This was where education entered detention policy. The U.S. Army Civil Affairs officers believed that re-education could begin even inside camps. Not formal schooling in the traditional sense, but guided instruction designed to disrupt old habits of thought. Writing, in particular, was seen as a powerful tool. It required reflection. It slowed thinking. It forced clarity. Unlike slogans shouted at rallies, writing demanded structure. American manuals from late 1944 and early 1945 emphasize orientation rather than punishment. Prisoners were to be exposed to factual information about the war, about the outside world, about democratic norms. The Information Control Division would later expand this approach through newspapers, pamphlets, and radio programming. But in camps, The process was more intimate. Classes were modest. There were no grand lectures. Often, a single officer or enlisted man with a teaching background supervised small groups. Materials were basic. Pencils, paper, simple assignments. Write your name. Write your hometown. Write what you did before the war. For some women, this was unsettling. They had been trained to repeat approved phrases, not to articulate personal experience. Others feared that anything written could be used against them. Yet participation was encouraged, not coerced. Refusal carried no immediate punishment. Compliance, however, brought small privileges, time, warmth, a sense of purpose. American officials monitored these sessions closely. Reports were filed. Reactions were noted. What emerged surprised many observers. Writing classes reduced tension. Discipline problems declined. Conversations changed. Guards reported fewer confrontations. Something in the act of writing seemed to soften the atmosphere. This did not mean forgiveness. The camps remained places of confinement. Guards remained armed. Authority was never ambiguous. But within that authority, a space was opening, one where words replaced slogans and questions replaced commands. By mid-1945, as Germany formally surrendered and occupation solidified, these early experiments would expand. What had begun as a tentative measure inside a few facilities would become part of a broader strategy, one that treated education not as mercy, but as method. And it was this method, quietly tested among detained women, that revealed a deeper truth about how wars truly end, not with the last shot fired, but with the first unguarded sentence written. For the women seated in those makeshift classrooms, the writing lessons felt disorienting. Many had entered American custody expecting humiliation or retribution. Nazi propaganda had long warned that defeat would bring cruelty at the hands of the enemy. The reality, paper, pencils, quiet instruction, did not fit the script they had been taught to fear. This contrast produced confusion before relief. Writing required them to focus inward, not outward. Instead of standing at attention, they sat hunched over desks. Instead of reciting slogans, they searched for words of their own. For women accustomed to speaking in approved phrases, this was unsettling. Silence filled the room as each line took shape. From a psychological standpoint, the writing classes served a precise function. Totalitarian systems thrive on repetition and external validation. Writing, by contrast, isolates the individual. It forces decisions. What to say, what to omit, how to describe events without prescribed language. American officers noted that this disruption mattered. Prisoners who wrote regularly became less reactive. Anger diffused. Anxiety shifted into concentration. The simple act of forming sentences slowed emotional escalation. It replaced crowd identity with personal accountability. There was also a moral calculation at work. Many American soldiers had witnessed concentration camps, forced labor sites, and mass graves. Rage was understandable, yet occupation doctrine demanded restraint. Teaching prisoners was not about absolution. It was about refusing to mirror the cruelty that had defined the enemy system. Writing lessons embodied that restraint. They sent a message, not of weakness, but of confidence. The United States did not need to break prisoners physically. It believed it could challenge them intellectually. Each of these angles, human shock, psychological disruption, moral restraint, intersected inside those classrooms. They revealed how unexpected treatment could reshape behavior without erasing responsibility. But these were only part of the picture. Behind the chalkboards and notebooks lay deeper strategic calculations, ones that treated education as a tool of power rather than compassion. For American occupation authorities, the writing lessons were not improvisation. They were strategy. The U.S. Army understood that Germany's defeat would not be secured solely through disarmament. A population trained to obey, document, and transmit ideology could easily become a population that resisted reconstruction, unless those same skills were redirected. Writing instruction allowed American officials to observe thought patterns in real time. Essays and short responses revealed vocabulary, emotional framing, and lingering ideological markers. This was not interrogation. It was assessment. Through ordinary language, officers could identify who clung to Nazi rhetoric and who had begun to detach from it. Angle 5. Breaking enemy conditioning. Nazi education had emphasized certainty and hierarchy. Answers were predetermined. Questions were discouraged. Writing lessons inverted this structure. There were no correct ideological responses. Grammar mattered more than loyalty. Clarity mattered more than fervor. This subtle shift weakened conditioning. When women were asked to describe their childhoods or daily routines, the grand narratives dissolved. The Reich became background noise. Personal experience moved to the foreground. This process did not erase guilt or complicity, but it fractured the mental architecture that sustained it. Angle 6. Women and post-war utility. American planners also looked ahead. Germany would need teachers, clerks, administrators, and social workers. Many detained women already possessed the skills required to rebuild civil society, if those skills could be separated from Nazi purpose. Writing was foundational. Literacy underpinned democratic participation, legal accountability, and civic communication. By reinforcing these skills in a neutral, non-ideological setting, occupation authorities were investing in a future workforce shaped by different norms. Reports from 1945 reflect cautious optimism. Officers noted improved cooperation and reduced hostility among women participating in classes. Some began asking questions, not about ideology, but about procedure, governance, and law. These questions signaled a shift from obedience to engagement. The angles converged on a single conclusion. The writing lessons were working, not because they forgave the past, but because they interrupted it. They created a pause in which reflection could occur. That pause would soon be tested. As Germany formally surrendered and occupation policy moved from theory into enforcement, the experiment would face its decisive moment, when writing ceased to be voluntary and became part of a broader system of accountability. The decisive shift came in the weeks after Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. What had begun as limited, almost tentative instruction inside a handful of detention facilities was now formalized. American occupation authorities issued clear directives. Re-education was no longer an experiment. It was policy. In women's camps across the U.S. zone, writing sessions became scheduled activities. Attendance was logged. Materials were standardized. Instructors, often civil affairs officers or enlisted personnel with teaching backgrounds, were briefed on objectives. The tone remained calm, controlled, deliberately non-confrontational. Assignments changed. Women were no longer asked only to write names or hometowns. They were asked to describe their wartime roles, to explain what their offices did, to recount orders they typed, messages they transmitted, systems they supported. The questions were factual, not accusatory, but their implications were unmistakable. This was the turning point. For the first time, many women confronted their own participation on paper. Spoken words could be deflected. Silence could hide uncertainty. Writing fixed responsibility in ink. It slowed evasion. It required sequence and clarity. American officers observed a pattern. Initial resistance surfaced as brevity, short answers, neutral phrasing. Then hesitation. Then longer responses. Some women crossed out sentences and rewrote them. Others paused for minutes before continuing. The act of writing exposed gaps between what they had believed and what they had done. The environment remained tightly controlled. Guards stood watch. Camp rules did not loosen. Yet the atmosphere shifted. Discipline incidents declined further. The classrooms became quieter, heavier. Not from fear, but from realization. Reports sent up the chain of command noted this change. Writing, officers concluded, had become a mirror, not one imposed by force, but one held steadily in front of the prisoner. And once that mirror existed, it could not be removed without consequence, because what followed would determine whether reflection led to denial or to something far more enduring. By the summer of 1945, the effects of the writing programs were no longer confined to individual classrooms. They were visible in administrative reports, behavioral assessments, and the evolving tone of camp life across the American occupation zone. What had begun as an instructional exercise had become a mechanism of transformation. American officers reviewing written submissions noticed a gradual but measurable change. Early essays were rigid. Language echoed official terminology learned under the Reich. Formal, impersonal, defensive. Over time, that language softened. Sentences grew more descriptive. Personal pronouns appeared more frequently. The women began to write not as functionaries of the state, but as individuals situated within it. This shift mattered. Occupation authorities were under pressure to separate levels of culpability. Not all detainees would face trials. Many would be released into a shattered society that desperately needed administrative competence. Writing provided evidence, not of innocence, but of mindset. It revealed whether individuals could reflect, contextualize, and accept complexity without retreating into slogans. The classes also changed how guards and instructors interacted with prisoners. Supervision became less confrontational, more procedural. Soldiers reported that women who participated regularly were easier to manage, more cooperative, less prone to rumor or defiance. Tension did not disappear, but it became contained. This did not mean the process was gentle. Writing about wartime roles forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Some women broke down mid-assignment. Others requested additional paper, not to comply, but to clarify, to correct themselves, to add detail, to explain what they had previously minimized. American observers recorded these moments carefully. They did not intervene emotionally. The goal was not catharsis. It was acknowledgement. By late 1945, writing lessons were formally linked to broader reorientation efforts. Educational materials expanded. Newspapers produced by the Information Control Division circulated inside camps. Discussion sessions followed written assignments, guided but tightly controlled. Words now moved from paper into structured dialogue. This was the climax, not because it marked resolution, but because it marked irreversibility. Once detainees had been asked to articulate their experiences in writing, the occupation could no longer pretend that Germany's past was abstract. It had names, offices, actions, descriptions. The writing lessons had crossed a threshold. They were no longer simply educational. They had become instruments through which the occupation measured readiness for release, reintegration, and responsibility. And as that measurement began to shape decisions beyond the camp fences, its consequences would ripple outward into families, institutions, and the fragile architecture of post-war Germany. As 1945 turned into 1946, the effects of the writing programs began to surface beyond the confines of the camps. Releases accelerated. Screening decisions grew more nuanced. American occupation authorities now possessed something they had lacked in the chaotic first months after surrender: a record not just of affiliation, but of reflection. For many women, release came quietly. There were no ceremonies. They stepped back into towns reduced to rubble, into families altered by loss, into a society struggling to redefine itself. Yet those who had participated in writing instruction carried something with them that was not visible, a habit of articulation. Occupation reports tracked this transition closely. Women released from camps where writing programs had been sustained were, on average, less likely to violate occupation regulations. They complied more readily with registration requirements. They showed greater willingness to engage with new administrative structures imposed by Allied authorities. These were not dramatic transformations, but they were consistent. In local offices, refugee centers, and provisional schools, American officials encountered former detainees who could document, explain, and correspond with clarity. This mattered. Germany's reconstruction depended on paperwork, ration cards, housing forms, employment records. Writing, stripped of ideology, became infrastructure. There was also a psychological consequence. Writing had accustomed these women to narrating events without embellishment. When confronted with denazification questionnaires or interviews, they were less likely to retreat into absolute denial or rigid justification. Their answers were not always remorseful, but they were more precise. This precision helped occupation authorities draw distinctions. It allowed them to reserve prosecution for clear perpetrators while reintegrating those whose roles, though complicit, were administrative rather than directive. In this way, writing lessons indirectly shaped justice, not by excusing behavior, but by clarifying it. Critically, the programs did not erase resentment or guilt. Some women remained bitter. Others rejected the implications of what they had written once they returned to civilian life. But even in resistance, the language had changed. Arguments were framed differently. Claims were structured, not shouted. The American occupation had not converted prisoners. It had recalibrated them. And as Germany's post-war institutions began to take form, courts, schools, municipal offices, the long shadow of those early writing lessons followed. What had been introduced inside camps as an experiment now influenced how a defeated society documented itself. Yet the full weight of this legacy would only become clear with time, as occupation policies hardened, softened, and were compared against other Allied approaches across Europe. By 1946, the American occupation of Germany had entered a more stable phase. Emergency governance gave way to institutional reconstruction. Denazification courts processed cases by the thousands. New political parties formed under Allied supervision. Schools reopened with revised curricula. In this environment, the earlier writing programs took on new significance, not as isolated camp activities, but as part of a broader pattern in American policy. Comparisons soon emerged. In the Soviet zone, re-education was faster, harsher, and more directive. In the French zone, administrative capacity lagged behind punitive intent. British authorities favored gradualism, but lacked the same emphasis on systematic documentation. The American approach stood apart in its reliance on records, language, and procedural legitimacy. Former women detainees appeared again within this system, as clerks in provisional offices, assistants in relief organizations, translators, and record keepers. Their reintegration was not accidental. Occupation officials actively sought individuals who demonstrated administrative reliability without ideological rigidity. Writing ability was both a signal and a tool. Long-term assessments by U.S. civil affairs officers reflected this outcome. Reports emphasized that early reorientation reduced friction later. Women who had learned to articulate their roles were less prone to conspiracy thinking, less vulnerable to extremist revival narratives. They were not absolved of the past, but they were anchored to documented reality. There was also an unintended legacy. Writing had preserved memory. Diaries, essays, and administrative responses created an archive of ordinary participation in extraordinary crimes. These documents, though often anonymized or archived quietly, contributed to the evidentiary record of how the Nazi system functioned at the clerical level. Historians would later note that accountability does not emerge only from trials. It emerges from records, from the accumulation of small, precise statements that resist erasure. The American writing programs did not seek confession. They sought clarity, and clarity proved durable. As the Cold War began to reshape priorities, denazification efforts slowed. Political necessity softened earlier rigor. But the habits instilled through early occupation, documentation, articulation, procedural engagement remained embedded in West German administrative culture. The pencils distributed in 1945 had long been discarded, but the discipline they introduced endured, shaping how a rebuilt nation recorded itself, governed itself, and confronted its own past. The story of these writing lessons does not end in redemption or condemnation. It ends in continuity, in the quiet realization that how a society writes about itself often determines how it remembers and how it chooses to move forward. The war in Europe did not end with a final battle or a single act of surrender. It ended in fragments, in offices without electricity, in classrooms without children, in camps where the defeated waited to be defined. Among those fragments were moments so small they almost escaped notice. A pencil placed on a desk, a sheet of paper slid forward, a woman asked to write. The American decision to teach writing to German women prisoners was not an act of mercy. It was an assertion of control grounded in confidence. It reflected a belief that the most lasting victories are not enforced through silence, but through structure, through the slow replacement of slogans with sentences. Writing did not absolve. It did not punish. It required acknowledgement. In doing so, it revealed a truth often lost in accounts of total war, that ideology survives not only in leaders, but in routines, records, and ordinary participation. To dismantle it, one must first make it visible. This approach carried risk. It assumed that individuals could confront their own roles without collapsing into denial or rage. It trusted that clarity could restrain extremism more effectively than fear. In the aftermath of unprecedented destruction, that trust was itself a gamble. Yet history suggests it mattered. Postwar Germany rebuilt its institutions on documentation, procedure, and civic language. Those habits did not emerge spontaneously. They were practiced early, imperfectly, inside places of confinement. In the end, the writing lessons remind us that warfare does not end when weapons fall silent. It ends when a society learns to describe itself honestly, line by line, word by word, under the watchful eye of history.